This content is on internal and external validity. So we'll start by talking about what we call elegant experiments. And you can see these words that we're using in this image, the 10 most beautiful experiments and elegant experiments. And these words are really used because science is a creative process. And when someone thinks of a creative, beautiful way to tease out a phenomenon of interest and test it, then those experiments are admired and they last across decades and generations and become what we call capital T theories in psychology. So elegant experiments have been designed and implemented to accomplish two things. First, they need to establish a clear cause-effect relationship between what is being manipulated and what is being measured. And secondly, it needs to produce these results in such a way that they can be easily applied to or generalized to the real world. So science doesn't want to stand in isolation. It wants to test a phenomenon or a relationship and then make sure that it fits in a broader population. So to this end, what those 2 points were talking about was validity. How legitimate is the experiment? And we talk about two types of validity. Internal validity. Did the experiment measure what it set out to measure? Did the IV, independent variable, produce the change in the DV, or dependent variable? And secondly, external validity. Can the findings be generalized to other situations outside the experimental situation? And so these are the things that we look for when we're determining how robust or elegant or beautiful an experiment is. If they have a really strong ability to measure what they wanted to, and if they also apply to the outside world, then we get one of those elegant experiments. So we can think of internal validity as truth in the study, a strongly designed study with good manipulations and measurements, which then can be generalized, following this arrow, to real life, to truth in real life, which is external validity. And that's the goal. So looking on, what is validity in research? So you'll see that I have first a definition. Validity in research: does the study actually test or measure what it intends to measure or test? And we can think about this in two ways that are related, but the one that's more important for where we are now in this course is the latter, the one that's in bold. But let's start with the former. So in measurement, we're always measuring something. In experiments or correlations, any kind of quantitative research, we're measuring something. And so a valid measurement tool actually measures what it claims to measure. So for example, if you want to measure aggression, you're interested in some factor that you think impacts aggression, but in order to demonstrate this, you have to be able to measure it. And aggression is defined as readiness to attack or confront. So someone is feeling fired up, they're ready to just challenge something. So how could we know if someone is feeling this way? So what you decide to do is use a questionnaire in which people just answer questions about how aggressive they felt after something happened to them. And the question that has to be asked is, does this actually measure readiness to attack or confront? Will people accurately be able to describe their own level of aggression, or would some sort of a behavioral measure be better? And a lot of people use a behavioral measure, giving participants in the research an opportunity to do something that might where they can act toward another person in an aggressive way without actually causing harm to the person, and that person would be a confederate and wouldn't be vulnerable in the experiment. But we can set up situations like that that might be better. And so in that case, the behavioral measure might be more valid than the questionnaire measure. Two ways of measuring the same construct. And so we're going to talk more about this later, so don't worry about this too much right now. But in experimental design, we think of internal validity, those 2 points we made right in the first slide, is the experiment carefully constructed and clean so that a clear cause-effect relationship can be established. And external validity, how well do the results among the study participants represent true findings among similar individuals outside the study? And that helps you answer whether your rights are generalizable to other situations or contexts. So we have these 5 key experiments that we have been focusing on. And the first is a class divided, that teacher who alternated days of having blue-eyed children or brown-eyed children feel subordinate. And so the independent variable was the belief that their group was subordinate. The blue eyes were inferior versus brown eyes inferior. She counterbalanced it, meaning she did blue eyes first. I think she did brown eyes first and blue eyes second. So she randomly selected which group would be inferior first. And then she measured, I put 2 dependent variables, but I'd say there were actually 3: academic outcomes, emotional outcomes, and long-term attitudes. And this was not an experimenter or a researcher. This was just a teacher who wanted these children, these white children, to have at least a sense of what it felt like to belong to a member of a group that was discriminated against or about which people had stereotypes and bias. And of course, you will already have watched one or both of these videos about this experiment, linked here. So next is Ash's conformity study. And that one you've gone through. This is the study in which individuals were placed in a group with other members of the group who either all agreed on a very simple answer and chose the wrong answer. And you'll recall that these 3 individuals in the group, when asked which line is the same length as line X, they all said C, which is clearly not the same as line X. And so this person, the question was asked, what's this person going to do? Agree with the group or say the obvious thing, it's B? All right, so that's what they were looking at. The independent variable was group error, group members being wrong versus the group members being correct. And the dependent variable was individual conformity. And you can see I posted the results up here as well. You've seen those before. And so we'll look at this study, another elegant study. And you can see the video. And then the Bobo doll experiment. There were many iterations of this experiment, but the one that we've talked about in this video is to determine whether watching adult aggressive behavior leads children to behave aggressively. And so you have seen how the study took place, but the children watched a video of an adult punching this Bobo doll or a video of the adult playing with the Bobo doll and a control condition. And the dependent variable was how aggressive were they toward the Bobo doll. And there were more studies that took place around this. Here it is again if you haven't seen it. And then the Loftus car crash study. The goal was to determine whether individuals' memories of a particular event changed according to the language of the questioner. So in a situation, you'll recall the individuals watched videos of a car accident, and after the video, there were questions about the accident in which different descriptive words were used. So the independent variable was the bias of the words. So participants were asked, at what speed would you estimate the car was traveling when it crashed into the other car? But they would change this. They might say in a randomly assigned condition when it collided with the other car, or when it bumped the other car, or when it rammed the other car, or when it hit, or when the impact occurred. So they changed the language, and then they measured participants' estimates of the car speeds. And of course, you can see here that the more violent the words used, the higher the estimates of speed were, suggesting that questioning techniques can impact eyewitness testimony. It's a video of that you will have seen. And then the Good Samaritan study in 1973, in which seminary students were either made to feel that they were going to be late to give an important talk, or that they'll be just on time if they leave now, or they'll get there with a few minutes to spare, and then they observed whether they offered help to a stranger. So we are, and you've seen this study, so those are the ones we'll look at, external validity. So how can we tell if a study has good internal validity? Or in other words, how can we tell if the design and implementation of a study demonstrates a clear cause-effect relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable? So one thing we can look at is the participants. A study with high internal validity, we should have participants who are similar and adequate in number. So what do we mean by similarity? Well, what we want to do is minimize the differences between the individuals in the group, because if they're really widely different, then we might have age effects or some of those other group effects coming into play. So we want to make participants as similar as possible, close in, say, age, sex, role, education, other factors like that. And so it reduces the range of what's called the error. It reduces the error or the range of individual differences that could affect the outcome. But you might be thinking to yourself, yes, but if we want to use different groups like males and females, we can't just ignore them. The other groups are important too. And that's very true. If we want to use different groups, we should definitely have males and females, but we'd always want to run a different statistical test for the males and females to see if they're significantly different in important ways. And if they are, then we have to do different tests. And if we have to do different tests, we need larger numbers, because we'll look at that in a moment. So that's the challenge of using heterogeneous groups or groups that have what could be influential differences. And then the second thing we look at is the number. We need to have enough participants to run statistical tests. Typically that number is about 30, and that gives us a normal distribution where we can run statistical tests. If we do have smaller numbers, there are ways of working with this, but ideally you'd have 30. And then the manipulation, the independent variable we'd look at. Is the independent variable effective in creating the conditions that are stipulated? And so first off, we would look if the manipulation is effective. So if we were trying to make people feel a sense of urgency, then we want to look at, well, did we actually achieve that? Did we cause our participants in different conditions to have different levels of urgency? A lot of times, if the researcher isn't sure about how well their manipulation works, like whether they've actually made their participants feel urgent, then they have what's called a manipulation check. And that means that for each participant in the study, that after their role in it was done, the researchers would talk to them and debrief them. And then they would use a manipulation check to see whether the manipulation succeeded in generating the intended emotion. And it would be like a questionnaire or interview. And they would analyze that to make sure that their manipulation worked. And finally, we look to determine internal validity. We look at their dependent variable. How did they measure their variable of interest? Did they find a good way to measure it? Does it actually capture and measure what the researchers are interested in? And so that's a third thing that's an indicator of internal validity. And so if we have participants that are similar, and ideally multiple tests for different populations, but for one statistical test similar, if we have enough participants, if we have a good manipulation, we've actually caused people to feel what we intend them to feel. And if we've measured our dependent variable well, we have a study that's high in internal validity. So in the Good Samaritan study, if we apply these, we might say their goal was to test the hypothesis that differences in sense of urgency would impact individuals' pro-social behavior or helping behavior. And so in this case, in the Good Samaritan study, all of the participants were male seminary students in the same year in college. So that's a nice homogeneous group. We should assume that they're similar then in age and education, and certainly similar in their interest and their desire to help other people. Their emotional state, they also kind of created a heightened arousal for all of them, because they told all of them they were going to have to make a speech. And that is known to create anxiety among individuals. Like if there's an experiment and you want to examine whether some idea can reduce anxiety, telling people they have to give a speech is likely to create anxiety, and then you could see whether your manipulation would reduce it. And finally, they had enough individuals in their study to run statistical tests. Then their manipulation, did they create that sense then? So in the Good Samaritan study, the sense of urgency they created were telling students who are already anxious about giving a speech that either they're late, or they'll make it just on time, or they'll get there with a few minutes to spare. And that seemed to be fairly effective when they asked about this afterwards, in fact, this manipulation check. And then the dependent variable, so they were measuring pro-social behavior by whether they actually stopped to help someone who was injured on the side of the walkway. And so this seems fairly decent, a real-life situation that might actually be encountered. And so they had the same actor being injured, so that shouldn't have impacted anything. And so we would have expected helping behavior if they didn't have this sense of urgency. So it's high. In general, we'd say this is high in internal validity. And so how about external validity? How can we tell if a study has high external validity? So this means the extent to which our research conclusions are generalizable to other people, situations, and time. And we can look at ecological validity. Can these results be generalized to other settings? So if it took place in a laboratory or in an office, would the same hold true in the outside world? We can look at population validity. Can it be generalized to other people? And historical validity. Do you think that these results would generalize over time? And we're looking now at many studies that were conducted in the 1970s. Would they still hold true today? These are all types of external validity. Here's a quick example. A company has developed a new dashboard infotainment system for a car and wants to know if it will work for drivers. They hire 2 teams to study the question, how can users change the radio station? How easily can users change the radio station in this new automotive infotainment system? So Team A decided to check this for the company, and they got potential drivers to come into their office building where they had this infotainment system on a realistic benchtop computer station in a stationary, well-lit, air-conditioned lab with members from their own team. And they got excellent results. All the participants completed the study tasks without a single issue or negative comment. So hearing this, Team B was excited and expected no problems in their study, and they used the very same system, but they put it, of course, in an actual vehicle with random people they recruited from around town, and they complete the study while driving on roadways with moderate traffic. And Team B was very surprised that when more than half of their participants experienced issues during one or more tasks and made negative comments about the system. So why did this happen? It happened because of external validity. So the first study took place in a lab, and it was a nice, clean study. They tried out the system, but it did not have external validity, so when it was tried out in the real world, it no longer produced the same outcome. And that's why we're careful about these things. The lab setting failed to take into account real-world situations, which will always make things more difficult and less clear-cut. And so when you're designing a study, which all of you are going to do, you want to mimic the real-world setting as much as possible while still allowing clear causal relationships in an elegant design. We'll look at this in a moment. So just quickly to analyze this in the Good Samaritan study. So this external validity is the extent to which research conclusions are generalizable to other people, situations, and time. First, ecological validity, can we generalize to other settings? I would, this is my own assessment, we might say yes to this. The Good Samaritan study took place in a setting, in the seminary school, in which helping behavior was, if anything, more likely to occur. Like even if someone if one of these students were outside just walking in the street, they might not have activated their school and their seminary mentality. And so we would really expect it to, helping behavior would be more likely to occur. And so the fact that it didn't occur even in this setting, we might conclude that in less constrained settings, the results would be more pronounced. The helping behavior might even be less likely to occur if there was a sense of urgency. So I think it's good with ecological validity. It took place in a natural setting too, their school, field experiment. Population validity, can the results be generalized to other people? Here again, we might say yes. More than others, we might expect people, students, studying religion with the goal of ministering to others would be more, not less apt to help others. So if we had people who weren't seminary students, well, the effect might be even stronger. That is, when these outsiders who weren't seminary students were given a sense of urgency, they might be even less likely to help a needy stranger. And finally, historical validity. Can the results be generalized over time? And we can't know whether a different cohort would behave differently. But we might speculate, since this is a very, very old parable, we might speculate that this is a fairly ubiquitous human trait that crosses boundaries of time. We also might take this old experiment, and if we have a reason to think it would no longer apply, we would conduct a new experiment and see if these sorts of effects still happen. So internal and external validity represents a trade-off. If we have too much control, like a lab experiment with really good internal validity, then it reduces our ability to generalize. Then when there's a real-world situation, that effect might not happen. But if we have too little control, we're doing it in an external world, in a real-world setting, but there's so many extraneous factors, then we might not have the ability to make causal statements. And so what we need to do is find a good balance. And that's what you'll need to do when you're designing your study. Researchers must carefully weight this balance when designing their studies, balancing the desire for a robust study, good internal validity, with the intention for the study to have some meaning outside of the lab, or external validity. Looking at the studies that we took earlier in this class, looking at a class divided, how was the validity? I would say the internal validity was moderate. It was actually a really good design in terms of, using the right number of participants. They were all Caucasian, similar in background, similar in age, attending the same school, and the implementation was really good. The blue-eyed, brown-eyed, she was very serious about it. She counterbalanced it so that each group had a chance to be the underdog, so to speak. And she didn't let on to it till the study was all over. So that was also good. The design was good, but the weak aspect was the measurement of the dependent variables. She couldn't do any statistical tests. They weren't carefully measured. They weren't even carefully defined. Her goal was just to give them this experience, and that's the goal of a good teacher. But a researcher would have probably gathered some more quantitative data in order to make a stronger study design. In this case, the external validity was strong. This was a real-world situation that closely mimicked the discrimination outsiders might feel in a world where they're deemed inferior, or they're discriminated against. And so this was a real-world setting that was reasonable. And it was also a natural setting. This was a field experiment. Students went through their actual school day in the subservient position. They went out for recess. They did their schoolwork, and they weren't told of the ploy until both groups had experienced the subservient role. So very strong in external validity. The conformity study, how does that one? Well, we'd say the internal validity is strong. The study used enough participants. They were fairly homogeneous. The confederates in the study, which is the people who were sitting in the lab saying the wrong thing, calling this line C as equal to X, when of course it's B. The manipulation was effective, and so we could definitely link it to the outcome. The external validity, well, low to moderate, I'd say. It took place in a lab, but in a real-world setting. Does this kind of thing really occur in just this way with such an obvious right and wrong answer? And that probably, is a challenge. If I were listening to this first experiment being described, that's a question I would have. But what I might do is conduct another study and address some of those concerns that I have about this study, and that would help advance the work and maybe get better external validity. And that's the nature of that scientific process. So you already know about lab and field experiments, and internal and external validity are related strongly to that. So lab experiments where the researcher has a lot of control likely has higher internal validity because there are fewer factors jumping in and interfering. External validity is usually stronger in field experiments where all those factors are taken into account. I mean, all those factors are influencing things, and if we still see the effect we're predicting, well, that's good external validity in a real-world setting. So as far as your work goes, those practice tests that you're looking at, you're only asked about the simple difference between internal and external validity. So if the question suggests that the researcher is concerned about a good study design with strong manipulations and a lot of control, then she's focused on internal validity. So if you're seeing things like that in the question, you know the answer. If the question suggests that the researcher is determined to hold the study in a natural setting with all the confusion of real life, then he's more focused on external validity. And so here's an example question. Dr. Franklin is designing a study in which he will go to a city park and interact with randomly selected people walking on a pathway, exposing them to an emotive scene and measuring whether they later aid a teenage boy who has fallen off a skateboard. And I might ask you, is Dr. Franklin more focused on having high external validity or high internal validity? And the answer to this would be that the researcher is emphasizing external validity by choosing to conduct the study in an outdoor, natural setting, even though some of the details of what individuals are exposed to might be out of his control. So hopefully you do well with this. Bring your questions to me if you have them.